Hello, this is Key Ideas, and I'm your host, Leela Viss. This podcast contemplates the rhythm of life as a piano teacher and music maker. Through illuminating interviews and transparent reflections, you'll feel validated, encouraged, and empowered. This is episode number 65, which is part 2 of my conversation with good friend and colleague, Emily McGree. Perhaps you've heard the term neurodivergent, but aren't sure what it means. Or maybe you've observed behaviors in students that indicate that they may learn differently, but you can't target how to guide them. Or perhaps you are in need of resources for how to help students with anxiety. This episode is for you. But first, make sure to back up to episode number 64 for part 1 of this conversation so you don't miss a thing. Emily has so much to share, and you will find her insight and advice incredibly valuable as you teach privately or in groups. In this episode, we continue our discussion on how to respond to a child who is disrupting the class and how to talk with parents about their child who is showing behaviors that may indicate unique patterns in learning. We cover how to approach neurodivergent behaviors in group situations too, and focus in on students who exhibit anxiety. Again, this episode is packed with insightful tips, so let's jump right back into the conversation. Go a little bit into the group setting.
Yep.
Because you teach a lot of groups, and it would be so nice if everyone was compliant and followed all the rules, but that just doesn't happen, right? And that's we're human beings, so that is going to happen. But when we build this sensitivity towards neurodiversity, how do we be in charge of a group and still address the needs of these people?
Well, I think that there's a lot of things that you can do, and I think it's going to vary widely depending on the students that you have in the classroom. You might have some who have some pretty specific sensory avoidance or sensory seeking behaviors. So if you're noticing that you've got some sensory seekers, they're needing some extra input in order for them to be able to calm down and focus. There's some very simple things that you can do, like putting those TheraBand exercise things around the legs of the bench so that they can kind of fidget with that with their feet as they're learning. They might need to sit on a wobble.
Hey, wait a minute.
Yep.
That's going to drive me nuts, but okay. Yeah.
We have to be flexible. Right?
I know. Yes. That's where I'm on a little bit on the other side of things, but yes, keep going. Yeah. Sorry.
That might also be done with maybe there's a chewable pencil topper that they've got on their writing device. You might also have some sensory avoiders in the room where you've got to be really conscious about, are they close to the window? Can they hear a car going outside on the street? Is the light buzzing and making a sound? Are they sitting next to a kid who is kind of on the noisier side? And some students even need to wear some noise canceling headphones too if they're in a larger group activity. Hopefully that's something that the parent will tell you, because typically that's in an IEP or a 504 for the student, but making accommodations as we can in order to make the classroom a friendly environment. It might mean no candles. It might mean we're really careful about snacks that we might give. It might mean that we've got to be conscious about the type of light that's in the room. All of those, we got to kind of go through the senses that we take for granted if we're on the neurotypical side, which again, I'm not sure any musician really is, but we don't always think about all of those senses and how we're perceiving those. And our brains might be processing that in a way where it's not challenging for us, but it might be causing one of our students to totally shut down. So I think being aware of our sensory needs in the room, because those are pretty easy accommodations we can make without changing the group environment at all. I think another thing that's really important is to make sure the routine is known. So especially if you've got some ASD kiddos in the room, and I think ADHD too, they need to know where you're going, right? So one of the things that we do in our group class is on the board, we will write all of the activities out. So they know exactly, okay, this is what we're starting with, this is what we're going to, this is coming next. Like they've got the plan so they can kind of see and visualize where they are. That kind of helps students with anxiety too. They know where they are in the space of the class. And I think that can be really important. We also have to, this is something I really struggle with, give very specific instructions with as few words as possible, and
And
not going to
very,
talk, right?
right.
Yes,
And very slowly,
very
because you and I
slowly.
both like to talk fast.
You
So
do,
yeah.
yes. And that's really important. You might find with ASD kiddos in the room too that you need to repeat those instructions. Neurodiverse kids sometimes can have a problem or struggle with executive functioning as well. So if you are a teacher who is used to giving 3 and 4 multi-stepped directions, they might not be able to follow that. So having a plan in place of either taking the students through one step at a time, writing the multi-steps on the board so they can follow that, be ready to repeat yourself or help them with that executive functioning can be really important too. I think that I'm used to calling this a calm down corner, and I don't know if there's a better terminology for that. But if you have students who are it's too much, they're sort of dysregulated, maybe they're overstimulated, maybe they've had a really rough day at school, who knows what it is, and it doesn't really matter what it is, but having a space in your classroom where they can go that maybe is a quieter activity, so that could be like a composer corner, a listening corner, maybe they just have a space where they can go and practice quietly by themselves with headphones on, just sort of a safe, quiet, calm environment for them to be able to utilize. I know in the public schools, there's almost one of those, I think, in every classroom until maybe 6th grade. I think most of them have a calm down corner, especially for the younger students, where they know, okay, this is where I can go if I start to feel a little out of whack. They don't always know what that is or why, they don't have the language for that yet, but a safe space that they can go. And I think that's an easy thing for us to do in the classroom as well.
Wait a minute. Now, sorry. And I want to hear what you say next, but now the calm down corner, you would not use that as a punitive action,
No.
Okay,
Yes,
yes,
no.
okay.
I think that's really important as a teacher, is that none of these things we talk about as a punishment or a consequence. We want students to be able to self-regulate themselves, right? If we can help them do that, our classroom is going to be much more manageable and productive, right? So if we can have a space where they can do that and they know that they can go to, I think that's important. So at least in my first graders classroom, that's what they call it, the calm down corner. But I think a variety of teachers have different names for that. And that can be an important thing to utilize.
I'm just going to say that, oh man, I wish I would have had that little tool, because there's been some times, especially, maybe, yes, hyper, but also just emotionally really upset.
Yeah, right,
and then you kind of feel like you're in charge of trying to make them feel better. And they probably just need to be left alone for a little bit, right?
That's exactly right. And this doesn't, again, some of these things that we're talking about can be really beneficial for neurotypical students, right?
Yeah.
If they had a fight with their best friend at school and they're really upset, like, who knows what it is? It can be a beneficial thing for, I think, any student. So that can be a good thing to utilize in the classroom. One of the things that we did during I taught a summer camp this summer at Lamont for our prep students, and we had just like these little bookmarks, composer bookmarks that they could go color and then put together. And occasionally students would, want to sort of detach from the noise and the chaos and the group environment and just kind of go and color for a little while. And that's all they needed. So I think just kind of having a space where that can happen in a productive way that is not punitive. It is not a consequence. It is not as like, you were talking too much, I need you to go over here. It's not that at all. It is just a safe space where they can go if they're feeling a little bit out of sync. So that's something that we can do. And movement, right? Making sure our bodies are moving, making sure that you're conscious of how many minutes you're spending on each activity. I think with the elementary school kiddos, anything longer than 5 to 6 minutes, you've lost them, right? You need to move on. And the younger kiddos, even less than that. So being aware of that, giving choices throughout the class is important. If you do have some students who are really interested in Star Wars, or they're really interested in whatever their interest is, right? It doesn't have to be an intense special interest, just whatever their interest is, that you're utilizing that in a way that can make them kind of plug into the class in a different level, and want to be a part of it. And to me, the other thing that I try to always keep in mind as a teacher, and I guess this is in the private space or the group space, is students who have neurodiverse tendencies receive so much criticism throughout the day. I've read various research reports that say anywhere from 20 to 40% more just like critical comments from their teachers, from their parents throughout the day than neurotypical students do, right? So self-confidence and self-efficacy and self-regulation, all of those things, all those pieces are generally speaking a little bit lower for students who have, any sort of a neurodiverse tendency. And when I say that, I'm also talking about kiddos with anxiety. I'm talking about our GT kiddos sometimes, depending on the type that they are, because they oftentimes can have anxiety or that perfectionist mentality, right? So they're only seeing the bad things that they're doing. They're not seeing the good things. So it's important to give constructive praise, and that doesn't mean good job. That means you held your right hand in the exact place that I was asking you to do. Like very specific. I really liked your staccato in that measure. I see you paying attention to this. Can you help us, with this next part? Just being very specific about your comments, and ways of trying to build them up, I think is important. And it's a way that we can sort of help them as a teacher.
I so agree with that, because I love it when people say, okay, give me a compliment, but I really like it when they give me a specific.
Yeah.
What did they really like? That's much more meaningful to me. And even if I may not be, maybe I'm neurotypical, right? I don't know. I wouldn't guess that I am, but, right. But I do appreciate specific compliments and comments and praise. And yes, you're right. So if they're going through this day of getting negative responses, most likely, especially after a long day at school, we get them next.
Yeah.
And they're tired, they're probably hungry. And so we're going to get some negative behaviors in class. So do you have some tips for us when we know that they could be doing better than what they're doing right now?
Yeah. One of the things that I try to be really careful about is reading the room when they walk in, right? As teachers, we have to be quick to figure out what headspace they're in, right? And if I sense that we're walking into the room dysregulated, right? And maybe that's a kiddo who just struggles with transitions. Maybe they've had a rough day. Maybe they've gotten too many critiques. Maybe they had to go to the principal's office. Whatever it is, right? Then I will change my lesson plan. And maybe we start with a breathing activity. Maybe we start with, a fun movement game. Maybe we start with, a question of the day so that they can have a conversation with their other classmates and connect in that way. It's trying to figure out what makes them tick and what makes them kind of center, right? And find their space and be ready to learn. Because if you jump straight into, okay, now we're going to learn our C scale, and they're all over the place, they're not going to remember what you're saying, and they're not going to learn anything from that. So sometimes you just got to take a beat and be flexible. And remember that, sometimes our goals need to pare down a little bit. Maybe I wanted to get through this technique exercise and this theory exercise and 2 more repertoire pieces, but maybe we don't get there. Maybe we just get to the point where, we've learned the first 4 bars of that repertoire piece, but we've learned a little bit about self-regulation and we have done some movement activities, and that's still success. So I think it's a little bit of redefining what success looks like as a teacher too, and making sure that we're flexible in that evaluation of the class time and of ourselves.
Such good information, because one of my favorite sayings of all times, it's a phrase by David Kessler, and he says, expectations are resentments under construction.
I love that. Yes.
And I think that's my problem as a teacher. Like, okay, in 30 minutes, we're going to get to this, and this, and this. And, we feel that pressure, and like, who is putting this pressure on? Like I look at my, like, where am I getting this pressure? And yet I still feel that. So thank you for giving us that opportunity to rethink what we're really giving our students. It's more than just learning the first 4 bars of a piece.
Yeah. I hope that we all kind of, and I struggle with that some days too, but we got to have the bigger picture in mind always.
So can we go just a little bit? Because you had a really good tip. I remember we were talking about your summer camps that you were holding. And so I said, okay, so what happens when someone's getting out of line? And I remember you encourage good behavior. That's pretty much what you were doing all the time, right?
Well, I think that that's really important to do. So I guess when I'm saying, make sure that you're giving very specific feedback, positive feedback to students. It's that we are always reinforcing the positive. So that can look different in whatever studio or classroom environment that you're teaching in, but maybe it's, I see you listening over there, so go stick a pom-pom in that jar. I see you, rewarding what you're seeing, and then you will notice that the other students will catch on to that, right? Well, like so and so got a pom pom for doing that, or a sticker, or whatever it is that you're rewarding them with. That's going to teach them more about how they need to manage themselves than me saying, "Hey, Johnny, don't do that." Right? They're not going to listen to that. But if they kind of see the positive behavior reinforcement, I think that's a really important thing of classroom management. Telling students no or don't do that, or like is just generally not. I mean, of course we have to do that sometimes, right? Of course that has to happen, but that's not usually the most effective way of classroom management.
And neither is using anger.
No.
And I remember, finally putting anger away. Like, okay, well, I know that is not going to help, but I see it in others. And when I was mentoring students too, young teachers, they tend to use anger and threats. I mean, that's the easy route to go, right? And so it is really retraining our brains as well.
Yeah, I mean that's not going to get you anywhere, right? That's
No.
only going to promote shame in the student, and that's they're going to shut down. They're not going to learn anything, right? That's not teaching them anything. So we have to be really careful about how we're providing feedback. And sometimes, you'll have a student who maybe they are a class clown, or maybe they are maybe they're trying to get attention in some way, right? So if you reinforce that behavior by giving it attention, they're just going to do it more, right? Or if they're trying to rile you up and they're trying to see if they can get a reaction out of you and you give them one, instead of staying really calm and even keeled and just kind of moving on to the next thing and addressing it and moving on, like you're going to see those kinds of behaviors persist.
So now let's go into, you've been mentioning the word anxiety quite a bit.
Yeah.
And we've just gone through.
Yeah. Yes.
Hopefully we're at the end of the tunnel of a global pandemic. And if there was ever going to be a time where we would see students with anxiety, it would be now. And it was there before as well, right? And so is this a symptom from neurodiversity? Is this a cause of it? I mean, how do you see it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be, a lot of things. And earlier in the podcast, you asked why I was, got interested in, and really that's the answer. When the pandemic started, right? I started really doing a deep dive into, okay, our students are not okay right now. We're not okay right now, right? What can I do as their constant? Right? Because all of this has changed. They're learning online. Their parents are probably stressed out. They're not able to see their friends, in the same way that they could before. But I'm able to connect with them. It might be over screen, of course, at the beginning of this, but I can still connect with them, and I can be that constant force for them. I noticed it, and I think in almost every single one of my students, right? They were all stressed. They were all anxious. I think sometimes we can have situational anxiety, and I don't know if that's a real term or not. That's just kind of how I think of it, where, we get overly stressed or anxious about something because of what's going on right now. That might not be a student who also has generalized anxiety disorder or a mental health disorder. It could be something that just, is isolated on its own over here, or COVID caused it, or who the heck knows, right? But the more I started reading about it, the more I noticed that, and we, at least the research that I read, talks about it as a comorbidity of other things, right? So if we have a student who is in the GT world, right, there are comorbidities that exist with that.
Say that word again.
Comorbidities.
That's a big word.
It's a big word.
Can you spell it? No, I'm just kidding. Yeah. Okay, so explain that word, please. Yeah.
It just means things that tend to go along with a disorder. So if we have, ASD, there are a variety of other comorbidities, other disorders that can go with that. So that might be OCD, that might be Tourette's, that might be ADHD, that might be, anxiety. It might be a whole host of things, and a student can have several of them. It might not just be one or two. But GT kids also, tend to have some comorbidities with that as well. And anxiety is one of them. Sensory processing disorder is another. And I think one of the tricky things about GT kids and going back to anxiety, right, is they're really used to being successful in a lot of things, right? And they have this some of them have this perfectionist mentality, right? So we always feel bad when we don't do something, and that sort of creates that icky feeling in ourselves, and that can lead to anxiety as well. So I guess that was a long answer, but that's where I started doing some more research, is when the pandemic started, and what can we do? So I had a variety of resources that were really helpful for me. And again, I've got kiddos who struggle with this too. And there was one podcast in particular that was really helpful for me, and it's called Flusterclux.
I love it. Yes, I've been listening now too. Yes.
It's an interview that happens with Lynn Lyons, who's a psychotherapist and an author, and a bunch of things behind her name if you read more about her. But one of the things that she said, and that we also learned from a therapist that I was taking one of my kiddos to, is that, well, first of all, we've heard the term, like, you got to name it to tame it, right? We've got to give it a name, and we have to normalize it, right? So talking about your own stresses, your own anxieties, your own processes through that can be really helpful for students. And then talking about it as this worry part, right? Like, oh, that's just your worry part showing up. That's your worry part. Your amygdala is trying to take control of your body. It's putting you in a fight or flight. It's trying to teach you that, like, a bear's running at you, a grizzly bear's coming at you, and you need to, so it has all of these physical symptoms that come across, right? And we have to learn how to manage those, right? So one of those is a lot of breathing exercises, right? So you can teach students, and hopefully this is something they're getting in other areas of their life too, because we are not their therapists, right? But square breathing, where we're breathing in by 4, hold by 4, out by 4, wait by 4. One of the things that Lynn Lyons talks about in her podcast too is mantra breathing. And this really spoke to me too, because I think, at least in my experience, kiddos with anxiety tend to have lower self-confidence and self-esteem, right? So if they can breathe in and say, I can do this, or I did it, or that's my worry part, right? So kind of teaching them some ways to really manage the symptoms that come from anxiety. That doesn't solve the anxiety, though, right? Like, we are treating the physical symptoms by breathing. We can do, I don't know if you've ever had students who do, like, the tapping thing, and that's their way to just sort of bring their body kind of central, kind of ground us again, and they might just tap their shoulder for a little while, or
They themselves will tap their shoulder.
If you're feeling anxious or a little bit dysregulated. I've had students who name the senses, so, like, 5 things I can see, 5 things I can hear, 5 things I can smell, 5 things, and go through that to kind of help calm them down.
So it's distracting their brain almost away from that anxiety, right?
It's giving the amygdala, we're telling it, well, we're calming down, right? Like, this is not an emergency. We do not need to freak out right now. We don't need to be in fight or flight mode. And then you can access that prefrontal cortex and go through the plans and processes. I think we see this a lot with performance anxiety, right? So where students will really get activated. Obviously, we all get nervous then and uncomfortable in those situations, right? But we also have to be doing things prior to that performance experience to set them up for success too. So that might be, some visualization exercises. One of the things in a book, I think this was from Smart Kids Worry. I really like that book too, where they talk about an I did it list, and having students compile a list of things that they did, right? Like I got up on stage and I played for this. I was able to learn this piece. I could remember, just a list of things, of accomplishments that they saw in themselves, to kind of go back to that and say, oh no, I can do this. This is just my worry part coming through. It's trying to freak me out. It's trying to take control. We're going to put it over here.
Hey, we'll get right back to the conversation, but I want to make sure you know about some of the music I use to immediately engage students, especially those students who learn differently. It's important to me that these pieces be fun to play and easily taught by rote, so the student goes home excited about playing a cool piece. Composer Wendy Stevens offers a vast selection of my all-time favorite rote and reading pieces. I know that if you try just one piece, you'll see why her music is known as music kids love. So I'm excited that Wendy is offering to give any Key Ideas listener a popular, big-sounding elementary piece called The Bold Escape for free. It's one that can be introduced through rote teaching if you prefer. Just put the piece in your cart and enter the coupon code Key Ideas. That's KEYIDEAS, all one word. Then hit checkout and it's yours to use over and over again. I think you and your students will love it. Look for a link to your studio license of The Bold Escape in the show notes. Now, back to my chat with Emily.
And that can be really, important too. So,
I've given my anxiety and fear
a name.
Names.
Yeah.
I think one is Brunhilde, and then fear is Frida. And that helped me. And I might have even gotten that from that podcast. But to your point about anxiety, it really hit my prefrontal cortex when I learned the definition of anxiety. And anxiety is worrying about what could happen.
Right.
Like, oh my goodness. Yeah. That's why, I have now decided not to use my Bluetooth pedal very much, because it has not been my friend on occasion and has really messed things up for me. And so it's my frenemy right now. But I've taken it out of the equation. Like, you know what? I do not need the stress of making sure that thing works. And it's usually operator error. It's me to blame, but it really has messed with me in a lot of times where, okay, I'm just putting that away for right now. But that helps me to think about, oh, you know what? I'm just worried about what could happen.
Yeah.
I've prepared well. I have prepared well. I have prepared well. Those are the things that I tell myself. And then,
right? Mantra is important.
Yeah.
I think that the other thing is, I thought a lot more about my parenting too, as my kiddos kind of struggled with this. And, of course I have tendencies of that as well, because it's all genetic, right? We don't want to pass these things down to our kids, but we do.
Oh, but we do.
So there's that. But, it's also providing spaces for them to practice overcoming their anxiety too. Something happened with my 4-year-old. We took a plane ride. It was the first plane ride we had been on since COVID, so the first one that he really remembered, right? And he had a total anxiety breakdown in the middle of that plane ride because he was convinced the plane wing was going to come off, right?
Oh no.
He was terrified of this, and it was like, okay, it's so exactly what you're saying. Like he was worried about something that could happen, right? And he could just not calm himself down. So my response as a parent was like, okay, well, we're not going to take a plane ride for a while. We're gonna, let him grow up a little bit, or we're going to teach him some skills, or we're going to walk through,
But that's not going to help you in the moment.
It's not gonna help, right? So instead, reframing that. Okay. Well, how can we practice this in a way that seems not so scary? Maybe it's a shorter flight, right? So we're going to take just a 2-hour flight instead of a 5-hour flight. We're going to make sure that we read a lot of books about how planes work. We're going to talk about our worry in advance of that and say, like, okay, now we're going to expect this to come up. We're going to expect to be concerned about this. So let's name it and walk through what we can do when that does show up. We're going to surround it with like, okay, we're going to fly to a place where people are going to us up from the airport that you know and love. So it's something to look forward to, and just kind of presenting it around a nice space. And I think that we can do that for students with performance anxiety or other types of anxiety too, right? So, okay, well, how can we provide a place for them to practice that anxiety, or working through that anxiety, right? That plan that they have around that anxiety in a sort of a stair-step way, instead of just throwing them on that big, huge stage with 500 people looking at them, right? Like, what are the things that we can do to make that easier, right? And then planning for that when it does happen, of like, okay, well, I know that I'm going to use my big belly breathing or whatever style of breathing I know I'm going to, do X, Y, or Z. And then, I'm going to start thinking about my plan that I've got in my head of like, okay, this is what I'm going to think about through my piece. I'm going to, in section A, I'm going to really focus on this. In section B, I'm going to, so they've got a plan in place, and they can really utilize that once they get there. But, it's different for every student, right? And every adult, and we all have our own experiences with that. And I think, when we were growing up, it was just like, well, don't worry.
Stop it.
That's not gonna happen. Like that. That's not gonna do anything, right? So, like, what? Don't say that, right? It's not going to be helpful. We've got to find some helpful ways to help them cope around that. And I think, especially because of COVID and other things that may have happened in communities, at least around where I live, or wherever you live, or other teachers, there are faster triggers right now, right? There's less bandwidth for students to kind of process through things, and those triggers might be a little bit stronger right now. So we've got to be ready to help, I think.
Now, Emily, you've said a lot of wise things, but we're all still wondering what happened on that flight. How did you calm down that little 4-year-old? Because you had a lot of, that was a learning moment for you. Okay. Okay. But what did you do in the moment? Did you have bubble gum? Did you have Benadryl? Did you have?
I tried everything in my backpack. I can tell you that, and nothing worked, right? Because we weren't able to address what was really going on with him. So now we've got a plan of like, okay, we can go through this. One of the things that, again, one of the therapists that I have done a lot of talking to about anxiety said, with kiddos who have anxiety disorders, right, is that, I spend a lot of time with parents like, okay, well, you're worried about this, so I'm going to go address this over here. So I'm going to address the plan scenario, and I'm going to have a plan for that, right? But kids with anxiety or adults with anxiety, that anxiety is going to move, right? So if we keep only trying to fix the individual circumstance, it's like we're playing whack-a-mole all the time, right? Like, okay, we're going to fix it there, and then we're going to fix it over here, and then but it's just going to keep moving until we really teach some coping mechanisms around how to deal with that worry part, because we all have it. It's stronger in some of us than others, but we've got to really address and teach skills around how to manage that.
And it's really comes down to self-awareness. When you're at a place that's not good, what is your coping mechanism, right? So that's what you're trying to give your son, is some tools and give yourself obviously some tools as well. Yeah. Oh,
therapy after that.
I know. On a plane, you're stuck. You're so stuck.
You're stuck, right?
Oh, well, we lost a pacifier in the plane. Ooh. And that was a lesson. You take 5. A pack of pacifiers, at least a dozen. But I know it's a really hard thing as a parent. I always I don't know, we're going on a tangent here, but I always just ache for parents who have unhappy children in a plane, because it is a really hard thing. So I hope you came out of it okay.
Well, and I think I learned how to manage myself in those scenarios as well, of like how, okay, I got to stay calm, because if I start freaking out, like I'm just, and as teachers too, when our students start spiraling, we can't go with them, because then how are we going to help them regulate? Like, we can't. So we need to make sure that we stay calm and just recognize that it's not about us either. Like we're there to just kind of help them learn how to regulate.
There's been plenty of times where I just really wanted to hug the mom or the dad after the flight. Like, you did well, because it is hard.
Angry, right? Of like, you got to make your kid stop crying.
Yeah,
I was
right.
like, trust me, if I could right now, like, he's miserable, I'm miserable, I feel awful. Like, there are all of these things that happen, right? So maybe be kind.
Yeah, I know. Yes, and be kind to parents who are parenting those children, right? It's not an easy thing.
Yeah, it's not an easy thing. It's not an easy thing if kids just have episodes, right? Like we do a lot of talking about neurodiversities, right? But we might have, you know, 5 other neurotypical kids in our classroom that just struggle with a couple of things right now. Maybe it's a growth spurt. Maybe it's, you know, they're trying to learn something new at school and it's frustrating. Maybe, you know, who knows what it is. But I think teachers need to be more prepared to handle some different neurodiversities along the way, whatever that means. Like if you consider anxiety to be neurodiverse or not, you know, that's your own prerogative. But we need to at least be aware of what's out there and what the resources are, and it's kind of what the proper language is too. Like I've learned a lot about, okay, what is the actual ASD diagnosis? What is ADHD? You know, like what are these things? Because I don't know a lot.
Okay, ASD, you've said that a lot. Let's just make that clear. What does that mean?
So that's autism spectrum disorder.
Okay.
It's autism spectrum disorder. Now we used to talk about Asperger's or high functioning, low functioning, those kinds of things. Those are not proper diagnosis anymore. So if you're talking to a parent, you're not going to hear that language. It used to be that Asperger's or kids with Asperger's were considered a little bit more high functioning or teachable, right? And that sort of came from the guy who coined that term. So it has this sort of negative connotation in the ASD community, right? Of like, well, you're telling me that kid needs, or that kid's going to be more productive in society than mine, and you know, so we gotta be a little bit more inclusive about our language, I think. So now it's they categorize it by levels. There's level 1, 2, and 3. Level 1 students need fewer supports generally in the classroom and at home, whereas level 3 students need a little bit more. But again, it's a spectrum. You could have a level 2 kid who is highly verbal, very able to be in the classroom, and just needs some extra sensory needs and regulation, you know, abilities. So it really depends on the kiddo. So I think we got to be careful about that. And then another thing that I didn't realize, like ADD isn't a thing anymore.
Oh, okay.
It's different.
Fill us in. Okay, now what is it?
It's all ADHD. So there are 3 types of ADHD. So you can have one that has just the attention disorder. So we don't have the hyperactive component, right? So we're used to that being like an attention deficit, you know, hyperactive. You can have a student who has both pieces, right? So the hyperactive or the impulsivity piece and the attention piece. And then you can have one who just has the hyperactive and impulsivity, you know, challenge. So there are 3 levels within that too. So when you're talking to parents and they offer information, right, we at least need to be able to understand what they're saying to us and what that might mean, understanding that every student's different, right? So we're going to have to adapt as needed but at least be ready to approach whatever, you know, challenge.
And avoid labels. Maybe it's levels instead of labels. But yeah, I don't even like levels because everyone is different.
No. And it's not like I again, there have been many level 2 and level 3 students who are very capable and enjoy being in a piano classroom, right? It's not it's not just because there's this, you know, so I kind of wonder if those are going to go away. But of course, there has to be some sort of a medical, you know, category so that when you're billing insurance, you have these things.
So you were telling me that you have consulted a lot of resources, but they were specific resources where you learned most of this from. So tell us a little bit about that.
So one of the things that I know we've had this conversation before, which, you know, maybe this is a atypical place to get, I don't know, teaching information. But when I first started teaching in the group classroom, I had no idea how to manage students.
Neither did I. No.
I knew what they needed to learn. I knew the order in which they needed to learn those things, but I had no idea. And that's the most important part, right? Like you're not going to be able to get to the other things if you can't manage the students. So I actually started reading parenting books. And I remember the first one that I read was How to Talk So Little Kids Will Listen. And that taught me more about management, I think, than anything else. So I've done the same for this, and or at least for learning more about students who are maybe have some, neurodiverse tendencies, or maybe they have a disorder, whatever the case might be. So in terms of anxiety, like I know that I mentioned that Flusterclux podcast, and I adore that one. And I think this summer she did a puzzle piece version of that, where I think there are 7 puzzle pieces or things like that, and it's this scaffolding kind of effect where you we're going to start here by naming it, and now we're going to so it's geared towards parents, right, who are maybe struggling with either anxiety themselves or with their kiddos, but I think it's really useful for teachers too, to be able to see these things in their students, and it gave me the language to talk to my own students, right, which I didn't have before. So that was really helpful. The other book, which I actually just recently got finished reading, that I found really helpful with anxiety, is Scaffold Parenting, Raising Resilient, Self-Reliant, and Secure Kids in the Age of Anxiety. And this is written by the president of Child Mind Institute. If you are someone who has no familiarity at all with any of these disorders, or just terminology, or what to look for, how to process it, Child Mind Institute is a really great place to go. And this book is written by the president of Child Mind Institute. And one of the things that I really liked about this book in particular, we do a lot of talk about scaffolding in education in general, right? So this is already like a concept that was really familiar to me, in studying Bruner and how we scaffold within education. But this talks about how we can scaffold students to help them become less anxious, more self-confident, more self-efficacious students, right? Or kids, if you're looking at it from the parenting perspective. So it talks about three pillars of scaffolding, and one is structure, right? And so we always think about that within our lessons in our classes, right? What is the structure of our lesson? How are we going to, lead the student towards success? Of course, we're going to use, very specific directions. We're going to address many different learning modalities. We're going to do, X, Y, and Z. But that's the first thing. The second thing is the support, or like kind of how you surround that student as they're going up through that process. One of the things, and I don't think it was from this book, I can't remember where it came from, but when we give feedback, sometimes we'll say something like, that was really good, but let's do it, but.
Oh,
right?
We hear the but, yeah. And
students with anxiety or any, any sort of self-confidence issues only hear that. They're no longer going to hear the thing that they did well, right? So if you say like, you did an excellent job playing with those dynamics, and I really heard the layers there. Now, let's try this, right? It feels like a different layer to them of diving deeper into that idea, and doesn't attack any of the positive comments that you gave them. So it's things like that, ways to just sort of surround them with support to help them take those steps, right? If they're feeling super anxious about addressing a new piece, well, of course, we break it down in chunks, right? We talk about how we learn it. We talk about how we practice it. We talk about all of those things so they can be successful. More successes, their building gets higher, right? So then our scaffolding gets higher. And then the third thing is encouragement, and how we give that encouragement. And as I think it's two things. One, it's encouraging those students to take risks. So like we were talking about with the anxiety, right? If we don't have a way of practicing our anxious energy, our worry part, right? If we don't have a way to kind of go through and be like, okay, these physical symptoms are going to happen. Now I know how to deal with it. Or, I'm really worried about learning that new repertoire piece. You're practicing the things that we feel like we maybe can't do. So doing that in a way that's supportive to them, but it's also making sure that we are giving very specific feedback again, in terms of having it not be about them, right? We've got to separate the person from what they're doing. So the book gives a lot of different just examples and layers of how to do those three pillars throughout, a student's experience to kind of help them along the process. So I learned a lot from that. The out of sync child, which you said this terminology earlier, so I'm going to bet you've read this book.
I have read that book.
is really, a good one. The first chapter talks a lot about the different disorders, neurodiverse, disorders that are out there. So that's a really good place for some general information. But it does a lot of talking about sort of the sensory diets and what students might need in the classroom if they are either sensory seekers or sensory avoiders. So I learned a lot about, how to, which manipulatives to have around, or ways to look for different triggers, right? Like maybe the student needs to bring in their own pencil because the way that my pencil feels, or maybe they need to have a stuffed animal with them, or maybe they need to, like all of these different things to kind of help them through that process. So that was helpful. For ASD or autism spectrum, and if this book really helped me more to just learn how to approach students, I think, or just individuals in the community. It's called Uniquely Human, a different way of seeing autism. And then, of course, there's the Whole Brain Child and the Yes Brain and all of those books that are really, really good too. I like Smart Kids Worry as well.
Yeah, I had not heard of that one before. That's
a good one. So I think that there are a lot of options out there, right? For me, I tend to find the most information. Of course, I'm reading it now from a parent perspective and from a teaching perspective. But I did that before I had kids too, and I found it very useful. Just in terms of, my general education, we don't always talk about this stuff in pedagogy books, right? Like it's
no,
not,
we do not.
It's not there. So, we've got to seek out other resources, and sometimes the general education field is just a little bit ahead of where we are in the music world.
Definitely.
Research. So that's always a good place to look, I think.
Well, that is an extensive list, and we'll make sure that we have all of the links to those books in the show notes. So I will revisit you. You can always just take a picture of it for me, and then I'll make sure I get them. So this has been so enlightening in so many ways. So thank you so much, Emily, for sharing your vast knowledge. And it has come over a number of years, but you talk like you know what you're talking about.
Well, it's a journey for all of us, right? There's a million more things to learn, but if I can help one teacher out there kind of understand one of these, disorders or aspects, or just different places to go, right? And my experience is not going to be everybody else's experience, right? All students are different, all people are different, and we've got to really make sure that we're being inclusive in the way that we address this, I think.
I think so too. And I think you have made us aware of the fact that all of us are in the same boat. We are experiencing a lot of what you're talking about in our studios. No one is going to be, what am I trying to say? Everyone is going to experience an encounter, right, with someone struggling somewhere. So we are not alone in this at all. So thank you so much for sharing that. So before we leave, can you give us a favorite quote?
Yeah. So the one that I think I say this weekly with my adult group classes is we learn from failure, not from success. And I don't know who said that. I think, when I looked it up, it said anonymous. But we get so wrapped up in everything being perfect and only having like achievements or successes in life, I think, right? And we learn so much more from those practice sessions where something didn't go right than we do when everything goes right. And as a teacher too, right? When we teach a class and we think it's going to go one way or a lesson and it doesn't mean anything other than we just got to reframe it and learn from that experience and come back at it a different way the next time. And we'll know more the next time around. So it's just, I think we got to get a little bit more comfortable with failure.
I like that one. I often think mistakes are information. And that's what I look at. If I am leading a group class, like, how did it go? Oop, there's a little flag there. Oop, there's another one, but not being self-judging as just, okay, that was information. Okay, what am I going to do next time to avoid that? Right. So, Emily, okay, we could go on and on and on, but I think we should stop. Don't you have to teach in a few minutes? Yeah. So thank you so much for joining us.
according to Emily, we didn't even scratch the surface of this topic of neurodivergence. There's so much more to discuss. I'm hoping that you've taken away plenty from the episodes that will help you understand what neurodiversity is and how we teachers can be prepared for someone who shows unique patterns in learning. In fact, experts in the field state that learning about neurodiversity can help us move the focus from impairments towards everyone's different abilities. Perhaps this episode has helped you shift your perspective on that class clown or that quiet, timid student. Perhaps you learned a little more about yourself and your own behaviors. Perhaps our chat has you thinking about certain adult students, colleagues, and friends who exhibit neurodivergent behaviors and learn differently. It's my hope that Emily has given you some general guidance and even specific solutions for the very next brain who walks in the door and warms your bench at the keys. Don't forget to head to the show notes for links to all the resources Emily mentioned and many more. And also look for the link to grab your free studio license copy of Wendy's cool piece, The Bold Escape. Remember to use key ideas, all one word, and no caps when checking out. A huge thank you to Emily for her time, expertise, and transparent reflections, and to Wendy for supporting Key Ideas. And another big shout out to you, faithful listeners. I know your time is valuable, and so I appreciate your support and for sharing Key Ideas episodes with your friends. I'm Leela Viss. See you in the trenches, keeping in mind that everyone is uniquely human.